Hello history fans, and welcome to my very first attempt at a podcast. I was going to say welcome to the podcast that helps you learn a little bit of history or helps you sleep, because then it makes sense being called Helpful History, but I don't know if I want that to be my catchphrase. So for my very first episode, I wondered who or what from history would qualify as the best thing to talk about, and luckily when I asked you guys on Instagram, History with Megs suggested possibly my favourite person from history, and I say possibly as there's about 4 women that I can't really choose between. If you followed me for a while, you'll know exactly who I'm going to be talking about today, but let's give you 3 clues and see if you can guess who it is anyway. So firstly, they're a Celtic warrior who fought the Romans. Second, they are written about in both Tacitus and Cassius Dio's works, and they are a famous redhead, although that's now being questioned. Any guesses? It is, of course, Boudicca, not Boudicca. That's a debate we'll get into later. So, Boudicca enters history in the year 60 AD or CE. We don't have any knowledge of her age or previous life. Some guesses say that she might have been a druid or a priestess, but what we do know for sure is that she was married to Prasutagus, king of the Iceni tribe. Sadly though, nothing before that point. The Iceni were a small tribe in East Anglia, or Norfolk now, so South Britain. All of the tribes surrounding them were working with the Romans, so it's likely she did witness the first Roman invasion of Britain by Claudius in 43 AD. And I feel like I agree with those suggestions, because even if she was born then, she would be 17, so to have witnessed them, I feel like that makes her like late 20s, early 30s maybe. I think it's a reasonable suggestion. The previous king of the Iceni had agreed a client kingship with the Romans, which essentially meant that the Celts would get left alone to carry on living their lives, but their king sort of went to visit the Romans and discuss things with the Roman leaders and things. But then the tribe rebelled, so the Romans disarmed the whole tribe, took away their king and replaced him with Prasutagus. So Boudicca has just been put into this position of somewhat authority, but she has to work with the Romans. So she's living the best kind of life possible for an ancient Celt, until her husband dies. Now, just pause for a second. Interestingly, Prasutagus' name might mean leader. So it could be like a stage name, and Boudicca, as part of the Celtic language, would have been pronounced in such a way that it meant victory. So that also may not have been her real name either, but something given to her during or after her time in history. It's Tacitus' spelling of her name that causes the different pronunciations of Boudicca or Boudicca. Most academics agree that it's Boudicca, as Boudicca was a misreading or a typo of a previous Latin text translation, possibly like reading the IC as an E or something like that, and they think Celts would have spelt it with one C, but that's not particularly important as most Celts were illiterate. So yes, it's Tacitus you have to thank for your parents calling her Boudicca and you calling her Boudicca. Anyway, carrying on with her story, Tacitus tells us that Prasutagus left half of his land to the throne, or Boudicca, and their daughters, and the other half to the Roman emperor of the time, Nero, that way keeping the peace. Instead, the Romans took their chance at making the tribe part of their empire's rule fully, and they started to treat them as slaves rather than allies. The Romans then are utterly disgraceful. They do disgusting things to Boudicca's 2 daughters and strip and thrash Boudicca herself, taking away her kingdom, her daughter's honour, and their standing as humans through humiliating gendered violence that causes not only a physical assault but also psychological, and some argue religious and political violence as well against the whole Celtic culture. Now, this humiliation was of course intended to force her into submission, but actually it sort of creates her power and helps her build an army. She rallies her people by saying that the Romans have become so imperious that not even the body of a princess or a child is safe, so the Celts must fight back. So just pausing again for a second, in ancient Britain, women could hold these positions of power as opposed to the Roman women, and even though she didn't have military training, her people believed she had power through her links to the gods that she had gained whilst being their queen. When she became, or showed that she was such a ferocious leader, it became clear that maybe she did have a military mind, despite not having the training, especially when she planned attacks on the 3 largest Roman towns. That kind of suggests that she somewhat knew what she was doing. She knew where to attack. The Celt style of fighting may also have taken, well, it did take the very organised, strategic Romans by surprise, because they were so chaotic. Supposedly coming out naked, covered in paint, the surprise ultimately caused at least 70,000 Roman casualties, and in the end she was only one battle away from genuinely causing the Romans to withdraw from that part of Britain. But in planned hand-to-hand combat, unfortunately, the Romans won. Spoiler alert, sorry. Back to the story though. At the start of her rebellion, she's not really considered a threat by the Roman Empire, because the Iceni are a relatively small tribe, but it all changed at Colchester. Colchester was the biggest Roman settlement at the time. It was called Camulodunum back then, and they had just built a brand new temple to the divine Claudius. That was the dead emperor who conquered Britain, stepdad of the now emperor Nero. The Trinovantes, another Celtic tribe, had focused their power base near here, so when they joined Boudicca and her Icenies, it really damages the Romans. The local Roman consul finds out about the incoming rebellion and sends 200 unarmed troops to just hide in the temple, because those Celts can't be a threat, right? So we have 200 unarmed troops and possibly like 1,000 women and children who just live in the temple anyway, waiting for Boudicca. There's then a 2-day siege, and eventually Boudicca's army take it by storm. The whole building is made from wattle and daub, so it just burns down really easily. I believe it's here that they also beheaded a statue of the emperor. Anyway, this is when the rebellion is seen as a real threat to Rome, and they realise, oh, maybe we need to up our defences and take this rebellion seriously. The Celts believe they might actually be able to overthrow the Romans, which leads them to teaming up. Now beforehand, the different tribes in Britain competed with each other for land, resources, trading routes, but this Roman threat presents them with like this higher cause to unite against. Getting rid of the Romans joins them together, and Boudicca begins to gather more and more followers. At this point, the Roman governor for Britain, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, is in Anglesey killing the Druids, because the Romans hated the magic Druids, and they're the group of people the Celts relied on most for their political issues, but for most things really. So, anyway, he's over there, and Boudicca goes down to London, or Londinium as they would have known it, and she burns it to the ground. Oh, I just knocked my water bottle, sorry. Paulinus hears of this and marches his legions of 10,000 troops back to London. He rides ahead and, to his surprise, finds London just completely on fire, so he evacuates a few people, but he doesn't really bother too much, as Boudicca has just killed everyone. Which is one reason why when she's pushed as a feminist icon, it's sort of like, well, yes, stand up for yourself, but she just slaughtered everyone. People were apparently terrified of her and her inhumane methods. Cassius Dio tells us that she used to behead babies and that she strung up Roman women, cutting off their boobs and tying them to their mouths. Obviously, we're not sure how reliable that is, and I doubt how reliable that is, but it shows people were scared of her and that she was a bit inhumane. Again, possibly. Remember, Cassius Dio is writing 150 years after Boudicca existed, and he's in Greece, so word-of-mouth stories get more and more elaborate. I do think she would have had to have been quite ruthless, though, for the Romans to have taken her seriously. But just have a think about our sources. Interestingly, Tacitus tells us that she was the only woman that fought with the Celts, and instead she brought the women and children along in carts just to watch the battles or slaughtering instead. Oh, and other myth busting. Sadly, she wouldn't have had a war chariot with spikes, but Celtic war chariots were pretty intimidating anyway. The chariot would have held Boudicca, and then there would have been 2 men below her passing up spears. So, despite no spikes, still pretty scary. Cassius Dio gives us the most barbaric description of her as well. She appears with her massive mane of lion hair, just down and wild, and she's wearing this huge torque around her neck. In layman's terms, I suppose, he's basically just calling her very tall and ugly, but obviously again, we can't rely on him as a narrator, as he's so many years later, and he just seems to hate women. And the hair debate. He also describes her hair as essentially really blonde, so she's maybe not the famous redhead that we all know and love. I don't know if love's the right word to use, you probably don't love her as much as I do, but anyway. The word he uses is xanthatatus, which is the same word used to describe the sun or lions. So make of that colour what you want, but it's arguable that blonde was her hair colour, not ginger. But colours are described different in the ancient world to how we do now anyway, so comparing our colour conceptions is tricky. So, should we meet in the middle of strawberry blonde? Anyway, rewind back to the story. The 9th Legion of the Roman army are on their way down from Lincolnshire. Now, this is a group of 4,000 men, or 3,000 cavalry, who were Roman Britain's elite fighters. The best fighters the Romans have over here. And Boudicca intercepts them and just wipes them out. I believe it's in an ambush in the woods, since they would be marching in formation. The Celts just swarming them from all sides with their wild fighting style takes them by surprise. It's simply an epic thing to accomplish, wiping out the 9th Legion of the Roman army. Impressive, Celts. Okay, we see you. We know you're a threat. Of course, this is a huge hit to the Roman ego, because the Romans don't just lose entire legions or battles, especially not to a woman leading barbarians, So Paulinus gathers up all the men he can, which isn't a lot really, only about 10,000 men, and they march to St. Albans, or as they would have said, Verulamium. But when they get there, it's all on fire. So, he's back to the drawing board and starts to form his military plan. He draws Boudicca to Watling Street and the final battle begins. We don't know exactly where it happens though, as we do have roads called Watling Street now, but both Watling and Street are Saxon words, so names given to the area a long time after. So you might live near a place that claims to be Watling Street. I do. I used to work on Watling Street. So, Watling Street was a thin valley. I've said that too much now. Sorry. The area of... Oh my god. Watling Street was a thin valley, and he essentially traps the Celts. His soldiers are in their classic formations, in front of the woods, so the Celts couldn't attack from behind and surround them. The infantry are in the middle of this bottleneck valley, and the cavalry are on the top of both sides, so the Romans have surrounded the Celts instead. The Celts then charge into the small area, gradually crushing themselves, and they're swamped by Romans on each side. And Boudicca's own army just keep pushing forward, and they can't escape or retreat either, because all the women and children are on the carts behind them watching. It's believed Boudicca had 10 times the amount of fighters, but the Romans' tactics prevailed over the Celts' wild fighting. Tacitus tells us that 80,000 Celts died, and the Romans only had about 100 to 400 losses, which I really just don't think can be true. But it does show how important this victory was to the Romans. She had put up a really good fight, and the Roman historian Tacitus had to be sure to show us that they really crushed the rebellion. Eventually. Sadly, we don't know what became of her after the battle. Cassius Dio says she poisoned herself. thought to be a weak, girly way to go. Like, if you're going to do it in a powerful way, or die nobly and bravely in battle fighting for your cause, is supposedly what the Romans thought. It just shows again the historians didn't perhaps portray her accurately, and they had to create a story powerful enough to justify them losing their 3 biggest towns and a whole legion to her. They've got to belittle her somehow. Again, even Tacitus we can't fully believe. Yes, he's the closest contemporary source we have of her, since the Celts didn't bother to write anything down for us, thank you very much. But he's not reliable. His history is literacy rather than objective fact, as I suppose you could say of most of us historians, or even my storytelling here today. It's clear I quite like her. But anyway, Tacitus twists her story into the story of the rape of Lucretia, which is a Roman story of a wife of a prince being assaulted by a Roman general. A big reason we can't take his history word for word is that twisting of the story. And in his histories, every woman seems to go power mad and just cruel. He's less concerned about telling Boudicca's story and more concerned with showing the tyrannical past emperors of Rome, like Nero, who aren't as great as the ones who rule now, as in his time, his contemporary emperors, is that the word? So there's no huge detail about her story, and we might not even touch on just how barbaric she may have been in Tacitus' stories. And that's something we can see in most retellings of her, because there's not loads of detail on her being a cruel woman. It's easy to brush that aside and just see her as this awesome woman who nearly made the Romans leave Britain, and who fought for what she believed in, which I do think is important to think about, but also I do think she's an absolute icon. Like, she wiped out a Roman legion and made the Roman general actually panic about her rebellion. This idea is actually something that I saw Kate Moss speak about recently, but her example was Florence Nightingale. Like, when we think about these iconic women from history, we have to remember their whole story. Like, Nightingale is remembered for her bedside manner and being this nurse, like, superwoman, but she was also apparently quite quick to temper and brash. But anyway, Boudicca's story has become more representative of a movement, as she's a feisty feminist icon, when in reality it's more likely she was just a barbaric warrior whose story is that of a woman out for vengeance. So although it's good that she has become sort of part of this movement, we then also see these extreme feminist, I should say, ideals pushed onto her, in the same way that Tacitus and Cassius Dio push onto her these hateful views of women. Her story is just constantly manipulated, is what I'm trying to say. And that's sort of what I took away from Kate Moss's talk as well. Like, in these stories of women from history, try and just find their story and not push all these different ideals onto them. Her fame in history is because she led a national rebellion that nearly threw the Romans out of Britain, and it was led by a woman, which is why it's even more impressive. But in reality, we don't know much about her early life or her as a person. I think key things we can take from her story are that you should be brave and stand up for what you believe in, but you don't have to slaughter everyone in the process, you know. Don't be barbaric. Oh, and she's also apparently inspired both Queen Elizabeth I and Queen Victoria within their own reigns, as she's a good, strong role model for women. But again, barbaric killer equal to men in history that we would most likely hate or fear for their actions and the death they caused. But the Romans treated her horrifically, so standing up against that injustice, you know, make your own mind up. It's such a shame that we can't find her voice within her own story, as the histories are written by the men who just didn't like her. If you do want to hear Tacitus's whole version of the story, about a year ago on YouTube I posted a video about Boudicca, and halfway through I just read from the Annals of Imperial Rome. That's the name of his book. And that, lovely listeners, is Boudicca's story. To finish, I thought I'd do a little 3-question quiz to see how much you were listening. No, actually to see if I was engaging enough. I guess if you've listened this far, I was engaging, right? Anyway, okay. So, who caused the name debate As in, why do we have the Boudicca debacle for years and years? It was, of course, Tacitus. He's believed to have misread an earlier Latin text and put Boudicca rather than Boudicca. Well done if you got that. What were the 3 biggest Roman towns in Britain that Boudicca burnt to the ground? Is that copyrighted? I don't know. Okay, so it was Colchester, London and St Albans, or Camulodunum, Londinium and Verulamium. And lastly, who was the emperor at the time of Boudicca's revolt? It was Emperor Nero, part of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, which is the best dynasty of emperors. I have made lots of videos on them, but mostly the women of the Julio-Claudian dynasty on YouTube. Anyway, well done if you got any of those, and thank you very much for listening to my first podcast attempt. I hope you've enjoyed. I don't know what you're supposed to do down here. Do you subscribe, follow? I don't know. Anyway, thanks for listening. I will catch you next time. Bye!